The heavy oak doors of the courtroom creaked as they swung open, revealing a sea of tense faces packed into the gallery. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that settled over a room like a weighted shroud. Each breath held, each whispered murmur of speculation, only added to the suffocating tension. The sound of footsteps echoed off the polished floors as 17-year-old Marcus Hayes was led inside, his wrists bound in cold steel cuffs. The chains rattled slightly with each movement, a stark reminder of the gravity of the moment. His expression remained unreadable, eyes forward, shoulders squared despite the pressure pressing down upon him from every angle. The weight of the accusations against him, resisting arrest and assaulting an officer, hung in the air like a silent verdict, one that his defense team vehemently denied. At the judge's bench, Justice Raymond Calloway observed the scene with the measured gaze of a man who had spent decades ensuring the law remained a pillar of balance rather than a weapon of manipulation. His reputation as an incorruptible adjudicator preceded him, but even he was aware of the unseen forces lurking in the corridors of power, their unseen hands shaping events from the shadows. The flickering glow of the courtroom's chandeliers cast shifting light across his lined face as he studied Marcus. The boy's presence at the center of this legal storm, as much a statement as it was a question. Was justice truly blind, or merely obedient to those who pulled its strings? Across the room, at the prosecution's table, sat District Attorney Martin Greaves. His tailored suit, crisp and unblemished, reflected the calculated precision with which he approached every case. Ambition burned in his eyes, a hunger that had been whispered about in legal circles. To him, this trial was more than just another prosecution. It was a step toward something greater. The media firestorm surrounding the case had only fueled his determination. Yet beneath the well-rehearsed poise and conviction, a flicker of something else lurked. An awareness that this trial carried stakes far beyond the courtroom. An awareness that whispered of forces in play that even he could not fully control. Seated beside Marcus at the defense table was William Carter, a man whose very presence commanded attention. His suit was not as pristine as Greaves's, nor was his demeanor polished to a political sheen. Carter's strength lay elsewhere, in his unwavering commitment to the truth, in the quiet fire that burned in his gaze as he sifted through the layers of corruption that clung to this case like a festering wound. He had seen injustice before, had fought it in courtrooms just like this one, but this trial was different. This time the darkness felt closer, the consequences graver. And the defense's key piece of evidence, the testimony of a journalist who had allegedly captured proof of Marcus's innocence, was now nothing more than a ghost of what could have been. 2 weeks ago, that journalist had been found dead. The official report cited a robbery gone wrong, yet the details refused to align with the narrative the authorities so hastily provided. No money had been taken, no valuables had been stolen. Only a single flash drive, rumored to contain footage of Detective Richard Langley's actions that night, had disappeared without a trace. Langley himself sat at the witness stand, his broad frame exuding an air of controlled authority. His record, though commendable on paper, bore the stains of excessive force complaints that had, over the years, mysteriously vanished like footprints in the tide. And now, here he was, his testimony the linchpin of the prosecution's case, a statement built upon shifting sand. Justice Calloway exhaled slowly, fingers pressing together as the hearing commenced. He had presided over countless trials, witnessed the full spectrum of humanity's capacity for deceit and honor alike. Yet never before had he felt the scales of justice so heavily weighted, not by evidence, but by unseen hands. The first motions were presented, the formalities of the trial unfolding with an air of practiced precision. The prosecution outlined their argument, painting Marcus as a violent offender who had resisted lawful arrest, who had struck an officer in a reckless act of defiance. But Calloway's gaze flickered to Marcus, watching the way his hands remained still, the way his posture betrayed no outburst of violence. Something in the boy's silence spoke louder than the words being wielded against him. Carter rose, his voice steady, unwavering as he contested the charges. He spoke of the missing journalist, of the flash drive that had yet to be recovered, of the pattern of complaints against Langley that had vanished under suspicious circumstances. The objections from Greaves came swift and sharp, each one met with careful deliberation by Calloway. Yet even as the legal battle waged before him, the judge could feel it, the weight of something more. The quiet knowledge that this trial was not merely about Marcus Hayes. It was about a system in which justice was often a game played by those with the power to rewrite the rules. And somewhere, beyond the grand chamber of the court, in offices where whispers dictated destinies, someone was watching, waiting, ensuring that the scales tipped exactly as intended. The proceedings stretched on, each side maneuvering carefully, like pieces shifting on a board where the stakes were measured in lives rather than strategy. Outside the courthouse, a storm brewed, not just in the sky, but in the growing unrest among those who had come to see whether truth could still prevail. Calloway stole a glance toward the gallery, noting the mixture of hope and despair that lined the faces of those who watched. A trial such as this was never just about the defendant. It was about every person who had ever feared the cold clasp of steel on their wrists, every voice that had been silenced beneath the weight of a system that did not always serve those it claimed to protect. As the hearing continued, Calloway's grip on his gavel tightened. He had spent a lifetime ensuring that justice remained unswayed, that no force, no influence, could turn the courtroom into a puppet show. But even he knew that this case was different. It was a test, not only of Marcus Hayes' innocence, but of whether justice could stand unyielding in the face of those who sought to control it. And as the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch just a little longer, as the unseen forces pressed in just a little closer, he knew one thing with certainty. This trial was only beginning. The trial continued with a suffocating intensity. Every testimony given by the defense was met with sudden objections from Greaves, each one delivered with razor-sharp precision, his voice unwavering as he sought to dismantle any challenge to his narrative. Every piece of evidence that dared to question Langley's integrity was met with procedural technicalities, swiftly deemed inadmissible. The defense fought with mounting frustration, their arguments met with cold, calculated resistance. Justice Calloway, for all his authority, knew the fight extended beyond the courtroom. He was being watched, not just by the public, but by those who operated in the shadows, those who had no interest in the truth, only in ensuring that power remained unchallenged. Then came the moment that sent a chill through the courtroom. The heavy doors at the back of the chamber burst open with a resounding force, the sudden noise slicing through the tense silence. Heads snapped toward the disturbance as gasps rippled through the crowd. A man rushed in, disheveled and breathless, his clothes rumpled and stained with dust and blood. It was journalist Daniel White, an investigative reporter who had been following the case with relentless determination. His face bore the signs of struggle, bruises swelling across his cheekbone, a thin cut tracing a dark line along his temple. His breath came in ragged gulps as he clutched a battered USB drive in his trembling hand. Murmurs swelled into frantic whispers. White had been missing for days. Some had speculated he had fled, others feared he had been silenced. And now, here he stood, his presence a ghost returning to disrupt the carefully constructed facade of the prosecution's case. He staggered forward, his voice raw but unyielding as he declared the truth. The evidence in his hands proved Marcus Hayes' innocence. His words struck like lightning, an electric charge sparking through the courtroom. The weight of what he carried extended beyond the boy's fate. It unraveled the threads of a conspiracy, exposing corruption deeper than anyone had dared to imagine. For a brief, shuddering second, silence blanketed the room as every gaze fixed on the trembling USB drive in his grip. Then, before he could take another breath, the doors slammed open once more, the impact sending a fresh shockwave through the chamber. The sound of hurried, pounding boots echoed against the polished floors as a group of officers stormed inside. Their movements were swift, calculated, forming a barrier between White and the rest of the courtroom. At their helm stood Detective Richard Langley. His face was devoid of expression, his eyes dark and unreadable as they settled on the journalist. Without hesitation, Langley reached for his service weapon. The cold steel glinted under the overhead lights as he drew it, his aim snapping into place with deadly efficiency. The muzzle of the gun pointed directly at White. Chaos erupted. Cries of alarm rang out. The gallery surged with movement, some recoiling in fear, others rising in protest. The court officers moved to intervene, but hesitation gripped them, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. The power dynamic had shifted in an instant, the illusion of order cracking as Langley tightened his grip on the trigger. White stood frozen, his chest heaving, his gaze locked on the weapon aimed at him. He had risked everything to bring the truth into the light, and now, in the very heart of justice, he stood at the edge of annihilation. Then, in an instant that stole the breath from every throat in the room, Langley's gun shifted. It swung away from White and locked onto Marcus Hayes. The atmosphere constricted, an invisible force pressing down upon them all. Marcus's chains clinked faintly as he stiffened, his eyes widening but his expression otherwise unreadable. A hush fell over the crowd, horror sinking its claws into the silence. The move was deliberate, a statement more than a threat. Langley stepped forward, the weapon unwavering, his intent chillingly clear. It was not enough to silence the evidence. The message had to be absolute. The accused, the one who dared to challenge the system, would be erased before the eyes of all who had come seeking justice. Justice Calloway rose from his bench, the weight of decades behind his voice as it cracked through the air like a thunderclap. His command was absolute, a force that could not be ignored. He ordered Langley to put down his weapon immediately. Langley hesitated. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. A war raged behind his cold eyes. Calculation battling impulse, fear clashing against whatever force had driven him to this moment. He had stepped beyond the bounds of control, beyond the safety of whispered deals and hidden truths. Now he stood exposed, every action laid bare under the unforgiving gaze of the law. Yet, even in that split second of indecision, something darker took hold. Then, in full view of the court, he pulled the trigger. The world contracted into a single moment, a heartbeat stretched into eternity. Gasps turned to screams, bodies lurched forward, and time seemed to fracture as the shot rang out. The crack of the gunfire shattered the heavy air, the reverberation echoing off the walls like a bell tolling the arrival of something irreversible. The bullet carved through space, a streak of finality aimed at the young man bound in chains. Marcus did not flinch. The room moved in a blur, figures lunging, shouts breaking through the static of shock. The judge, the attorneys, the court officers, each frozen in the brutal realization of what was happening. Justice was no longer a concept debated within these walls. It was a battlefield, and the battle had just been brought to its doorstep. The force of the gunshot sent the courtroom into pandemonium. The chain reaction of movement and sound blurred into a single overwhelming surge. The fate of Marcus Hayes hung in the balance, suspended in the chaos that had transformed the hallowed chambers of justice into a war zone. A gunshot rang through the courtroom. But when the smoke cleared, Marcus Hayes was still standing. Justice Calloway had acted in the only way he could. His gavel slammed against the desk with a force that sent a resounding crack through the tense air, a single decisive action that threw Langley's aim just enough to send the bullet veering off course. The round embedded itself in the wooden paneling behind Marcus, splintering it with a sharp, jagged hole, but harming no one. For a fraction of a second, the room was frozen in stunned silence, a breath held collectively by everyone present. Then, pandemonium erupted. The courtroom dissolved into chaos. Officers surged forward, some moving instinctively to restrain Langley, others hesitating as uncertainty gripped them. The lines of allegiance blurred in an instant, some drawn to uphold their duty, others faltering, caught between orders and fear. Langley stood rigid, his weapon still clutched tightly in his hand, his expression unreadable beneath the flickering lights. The chamber, once a place of law and order, had become an arena of shifting power. District Attorney Martin Greaves did not move at first. His posture remained unchanged, but his eyes, dark and piercing, flicked toward Calloway with something new. Cold calculation replacing the momentary flash of shock that had crossed his face. Slowly, deliberately, he turned, stepping toward the bench as the roar of the courtroom surged around them. The words he spoke were barely audible over the noise, but they cut through nonetheless. Calloway did not understand what he was interfering with. This case had never been meant to reach this point. The words carried weight, not as a threat but as an inevitability. A quiet admission that forces greater than those present had already decided the outcome long before the trial had begun. Greaves's voice held no anger, no desperation, only certainty. This was not about a single case, not about Marcus Hayes, nor even about Langley. It was about control. And Calloway, despite all his years on the bench, was dangerously close to tipping the scales where they were never meant to be tipped. A muscle in Calloway's jaw tightened. He had presided over countless cases, seen corruption festering beneath polished veneers, but never had the rot been so boldly laid bare before him. The pressure was suffocating, the weight of unseen hands pushing against him, urging him to fold, to let this moment pass into obscurity like so many before it. But something in him rebelled. His hand tightened around the gavel. He had spent decades in service of the law, and if he was to be tested now, then he would not be found wanting. His voice rang out, cutting through the storm of voices, his authority crashing over the room like thunder. Detective Richard Langley was under arrest for attempted murder. The order hung in the air, unshakable. The chamber held its breath, waiting for the response, for the unraveling of whatever fragile order still remained. The officers closest to Langley exchanged glances, uncertainty flickering in their expressions. Some hesitated, their loyalties suddenly thrown into question, but others, those who still held fast to their oath, moved swiftly. 2 officers seized Langley's arms, twisting them behind his back. For a moment, he resisted, his body tensing as if he might fight back, but then something in him gave way. His fingers loosened, the gun slipping from his grasp, clattering to the polished floor. His expression did not change, his face carved from stone, but his silence spoke louder than any protest could have. He knew this battle was lost, but the war was far from over. Greaves watched, his expression unreadable. He did not intervene, did not speak, but his gaze remained fixed on Calloway. This was not the end, the look seemed to say. It was merely a deviation from the plan, a slight disruption in a script that was already written. Calloway could feel it in his bones. He had forced their hand, but there would be consequences. The officers dragged Langley away, disappearing through the side doors. The murmurs from the gallery swelled into a cacophony, the weight of the moment pressing down upon everyone present. The trial had spiraled beyond anything expected, and now the questions loomed like specters in the air. What happened next? Who truly held power in this courtroom? And how much time did Justice Calloway have before the full weight of those unseen forces came crashing down upon him? The case had taken a turn that no one had expected. The attempted murder of Marcus Hayes in open court had sparked outrage, and the media storm that followed was unlike anything the city had ever seen. Protests erupted in the streets, voices demanding accountability, as headlines screamed of judicial failure and corruption buried deep within the system. Calls for an independent investigation echoed through the nation, but in the shadows, the powers that be were already working to bury the case. Calloway received anonymous threats, cryptic messages left on his desk, the weight of unseen eyes following him wherever he went. Marcus was placed in solitary confinement, the official reason given as for his own protection, though Calloway knew better. The boy had survived the trial, but survival was not the same as freedom. And then there was Daniel White, gone without a trace, his apartment emptied overnight, his phone disconnected. The journalist who had risked everything had simply vanished, as though he had never existed at all. Meanwhile, Greaves moved through the chaos untouched, his composed exterior never faltering, his influence still rippling beneath the surface. But Calloway refused to yield. The law was a slow-moving beast, but when wielded correctly, it could become a weapon. He filed formal requests, pushed for an independent federal investigation, and one by one, he exposed the cracks in the foundation. The case was no longer about Langley alone. It had become a window into a sprawling network of corruption, one that reached into the highest echelons of law enforcement and politics. The battle was long, brutal, and filled with betrayals. Some judges who had once stood beside him caved under pressure, their decisions bending in ways that were all too convenient. Some officers, who had remained silent for years, finally stepped forward, revealing cover-ups that spanned decades. The weight of suppressed truths began to tip the scales. Then came the final twist. A former police captain, once considered untouchable, came forward with something no one had anticipated. Documents, meticulously recorded and hidden away, revealed the true reason Marcus Hayes had been targeted. He had not been arrested for resisting or assaulting an officer. He had been hunted because he had witnessed something he was never meant to see. 2 weeks before his arrest, on an otherwise uneventful evening, he had unknowingly become a witness to an execution, An off-duty officer had taken the life of an unarmed civilian in a darkened alleyway, and Marcus had been the only one to see it happen. Langley had not arrested him for a crime. He had been sent to silence him before the truth could ever come to light. With this revelation, the case detonated. What had once been whispers of misconduct became undeniable proof of a system built to protect itself at all costs. High-ranking officials, men and women who had once considered themselves untouchable, found themselves at the mercy of grand juries and federal investigations. Langley, the man who had so brazenly tried to end a life in open court, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Greaves resigned in disgrace, slipping away into the shadows, though the murmurs suggested he had merely been a puppet, a visible face for those who still remained behind the curtain, untouched and waiting. And Marcus Hayes? He walked free. The chains that had bound him had been cut away, the weight of false accusations lifted at last. But freedom came at a cost. He stepped outside the courthouse, the sky above stretching endlessly, yet his shoulders remained tense, his eyes carrying the ghosts of what had been stolen from him. Justice had been served, but it had not come without scars. Calloway watched him go, a quiet weight settling in his chest as he considered the reality that had unfolded before him. How many other Marcus Hayeses were out there? How many had never made it this far? How many stories had been swallowed by the system, silenced before they could ever be told? The battle had been won, but the war was far from over.